Hey everyone, and welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Please do follow us on all of the standard podcast platforms and find us on our YouTube channel. Leave your comments in the sections below, and we will get to them in some upcoming podcasts. So guys, jumping off, we've seen some movement recently kind of in the world of AI towards GPT-5 or what GPT-5 might become. Recently, Sam Altman and Brad Lightcap were on a podcast kind of speculating and kind of setting the stage for how they think about that internally. So I want to use that as a kind of a kicking off point to have kind of a longer discussion around what we think is going to happen in kind of the broader realm of AI, particularly as it goes with these foundation models and how we think that might be influencing our business at ScholarAI. So Sashi, why don't you kick us off, kind of set the stage for what you're thinking, then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sounds good. It's been a couple of weeks. We've missed you guys. So my gut feel from this video, so this is the 20VC recording with Sam and Brad Lightcap, also a Dookie. Shout out to Duke. So what's the gut feel? So first Sam and Brad talk about GPT-4 and GPT-3 being really not that great of models. And I think what that highlights is the gap between functionality that end users want, the deeper functionality, not just kind of simple rewrite this email for me or what's the height of the Empire State Building, but deeper work that needs to get done by end users, and the interest and desire to use large language models to help get interesting work done, create efficiencies in people's internal workflows. And what Sam observes in this recording is that lots of people are building small pieces on top of GPT-3, GPT-4 to create more functionality for those end users who want that today, who can't get that out of the model. Sam suggested that all the builders out there, 95% of them, as he says, should be building, assuming the models get better, not creating patches or improvements where the models aren't as good as end users want them to be. And I would just sort of observing kind of the dynamic there. So his thought is that everyone should be building, 95% of people should be building, assuming the models get a lot better, and creating value should the models get a lot better. But instead, he sees 95% of people building where the models aren't as good as they should be, but those people are going to get run over when the models get better. And so just taking that observation, the way I'm internalizing that is, what are the ways in which an application, ScholarAI, or any other application positions itself for models getting a lot better? My instinct in that is that it assumes this maximalist territory of OpenAI and ChatGPT in particular. And I'm not sure that's how it's going to play out. And that's because of the two dependencies, one on data. Can ChatGPT gather a lot more data than it's got? And then second, compute. Can it have a lot more compute than it's got? And there are just some physical limitations, number of data centers, access to resources, financial resources to fund those data centers that I think are interesting and important questions to ask. And the amount of capital needed to supply that compute resource may be a bottleneck step. So I'm not sure that this kind of inevitable outcome will be, as Sam describes, of kind of maximalist GPT capability and leaving the sort of scraps for everything else. So that's sort of just an observation. Second, I think he's probably right that a lot of the apps out there, the GPTs out there, are building for the deficiencies of the models today, whether those are RAG-based systems like ours or other systems that kind of improve upon the functionality where GPT-4 is not as full-featured as desired. I could see, for example, GPT-5, GPT-6, or whatever those get called, having multi-agents, improving upon the deficiencies where RAG is used today, having better search and synthesis capabilities. I can see all of that happening. Where are the moats? Moats for companies like ours are in deeply understanding the user workflow inside of a process, inside of a very specific work process that will never be the territory of a GPT, because they're never going to bother getting to know deeply the process of a scientific discovery, or getting to know deeply the process of a patent and how to generate a new patent. For most of those use cases, they'll just never bother getting deep enough. It's the same way that Google never bothered getting deep enough for most use cases beyond kind of the general consumer search.
Yeah, I think When I was watching that video, the one thing that I found kind of difficult to just kind of like reconcile dialogue wise is the statement that was made was like, assume like the companies that'll do well are ones that improve when our models improve, right? Makes sense. If the reasoning capability of these models goes up, fantastic. If you have like a medical case or something like that, and the newest GPT has seen a lot more medical data, sure, your tool probably gets a lot better. I think the place that I see like that I think is a little bit more gray to me is OpenAI also seems to be featureizing stuff that's not just the model, right? They're providing like a service architecture for RAG. The assistance API has like, we want to put web browsing in here, right? I guess I think the thing that I've yet to kind of like read properly or like kind of get a sense of OpenAI's kind of stance out formally is like how much they want to be a model company, how much they want to be like an API service company, right? Because those two things are very inherently different. And if you assume the steamroll happens on the model side, the companies that are worried are those like, oh, we fine tuned for customer emails or we fine tuned for medical data, right? There you feel a bit more vulnerable. But I think more deeply, you see a lot of companies, I think like a very, very large number of companies that are like, we're not fine tuning. What we're doing is RAG. What we're doing is like prompting. What we're doing is like data retrieval and data mix and matching with a model as a piece of it, right? If I hadn't seen OpenAI say we were releasing like a RAG implementation in the assistance API, I'd probably be like, okay, yeah, like RAG is still kind of open fertile ground. Like you do RAG on some specific data set that has value and that kind of stands and grows as the model's reasoning continues to improve, right? If the model is suddenly better able to read the SQL table that you parsed out from like 7 different sources, you're still good. The model improving makes you improve. But on the other hand, they're doing stuff like making the API much more horizontal in regards to like what are the features of a LLM app that can cover. I don't really think I have like a good read on it, nor do I have like a good impression of, you know, like how I feel about that sort of thing overall. I think ultimately Shashi's right in that like the user and the way that you handle their problems and basically how much they love you is kind of the defining criteria. But at least at like the technical level, I think it's perplexing, at least in some capacity, to just think about like how much is OpenAI a model first company versus how much are they a service or AI tooling company.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was excited to hear your kind of thoughts, Lakshay, just as a builder who is kind of working with these tools a lot. I think that the way that I think two things become pretty apparent having listened to that conversation, having listened to conversations across AI in bulk, in that people don't know. People simply don't know how fast these models are going to improve and to what level these models will improve to. Meaning, like, we're seeing lots of people kind of place their bets on needing these other kind of supplementary tools that sit on top of models to solve for these tasks. We are also seeing others simply saying these models are going to get good enough and we're going to specialize in our go-to-market or our, like you all are alluding to, our understanding of this particular use case, right? Our ability to integrate these foundation models and their capabilities into workflows. And then these workflows will continue to exist. And as the baseline, level of these models improve, our efficiency gains in this workflow will improve with those things. I think the thing that is apparent to me, just restating for kind of emphasis, is that we simply don't know. I mean, I think even OpenAI, to your point, Akshay, is making a hedged bet, and they're saying we are going to continue to improve models, but also we believe that there may be a potential to improve these models in addition to just simply the models themselves with other developer tools or other kind of, like you're saying, RAG-based implementations and those kind of things. The only thing that feels to me fairly concrete as we've seen models get better and better is that the room for fine tuning is shrinking. It's not necessarily to say that fine tuning is going to go away ever. There may be some kind of edge cases in which fine tuning makes a very large difference. But to me, it does feel like a reliance on fine tuning, especially as these models do improve and these models grow in parameter size, etc., that the importance of fine tuning is going to diminish. And so I think that, I see lots of narratives. It's fine tuning or RAG. To me, it feels much more like RAG is going to always be necessary in some capacity, simply because these models are always going to have a knowledge cutoff. They're always going to only see a subset of all the available data, simply because after the models are published, new data comes out on a daily basis. So RAG in some form or semblance is always going to be important. I can pretty clearly envision a world in which fine tuning is no longer necessary for the majority of use cases, even if it is still important for, a very few subset of use cases. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think the problem with, at least if you're going to assume that you're fine tuning a large language model, you kind of always have an event horizon of there is a patch basically that's coming that makes the work you've done not redundant, but outdated, right? Like you're always going to, if you're going to be fine tuning, like in principle, you'd always want it to be on the most highly reasoned, highly capable model. It's just not, like in most cases, probably cost effective to assume that you have to do that every single time. I think I do see cases where, like, if you were to look at like smaller applications, like within the context of like an enterprise, like maybe there are like very, very highly specialized, like, I mean, this happens in like tech companies all the time, like a micro database spun up, like a very tiny, like singular API app. In that case, you might have like a small language model. You have enough data that you can just like train those over the course of like 24 hours and your app's up to date. No problem. That still exists. But I think fine tuning like large language models, like I personally would not spend time on that sort of resource. It seems like a wasted effort.
I'm curious if you see, so just to raise another interesting YouTube video, Chamath and Jonathan Ross, who's the CEO of GROC, another GPU processor alternative to Nvidia, did an interesting video. And the conversation was around in a way, it got to the maximalist nature of Nvidia and how CUDA is a great lock-in. So users of CUDA will be pretty committed to using Nvidia-based hardware, but there's lots of opportunity for users to use other hardware that could be more efficient, energy efficient, using fewer cycles, so faster processing time, perhaps using the GROC hardware. And they've got, I believe you said 75,000 developers already on their platform in 30 days. This is an interesting take, and that there may be much more efficient ways of running your compute not reliant on CUDA. I thought this was an interesting take. And also what was mentioned here, the reason I bring it up in this conversation is that they describe NVIDIA as also having this sort of maximalist approach of like, we're going to eat everything. And we don't need to be defined by a narrow category like we described earlier, but rather kind of expansive into everything we feel like touching. And we see that with NVIDIA kind of working in the direction of models and creating their own models to build on top of. Do you see NVIDIA also pursuing sort of this maximalist approach, and what's your reaction to that?
Or what they call their global conference. But I watched the GTC like end to end, which was in March, basically. And kind of like, at least my main takeaway is like NVIDIA, they're already very, very well positioned to do this sort of thing. Again, they have ubiquity, at least in like the AI space, and like prominence enough that in a lot of cases, like companies are coming to them to help them like basically consult and build products on their hardware. I think my perception of NVIDIA is that between OpenAI and NVIDIA, I would be probably more, I guess if I had to choose one or the other to put stock into, I'd probably put NVIDIA, simply because I think with the stuff that they've shown, like they're very, very heavy on agents. They already are like in the places that data lives. They're already like, they have hardware, they have the like tooling that a software patch is all they kind of really need to become a RAG like provider, to become a GPU like service layer provider. I don't think that NVIDIA has moved a lot in that capacity very soon. Like, I don't think I've seen personally a lot of developers saying NVIDIA is where I'm going to be building first. Just because OpenAI makes a lot of the heavy lift of going from here's my contained code to here's something that's running very simple. But I think in like the longer term future, Nvidia is just like very, very nicely positioned. And is already like super robust, has all the business processes, already has the distribution. They just need to activate the software that makes all of that livable. I don't know if you guys watched it, but they had, I forget what the terminology they used for it was, but they want to basically like make like an agent control plane. This is of course like very, very future oriented. But in that control plane, there was, hey, we are running 3D simulations of your factory environments, 3D simulations of our like biomedical environments. Now we're going to have agents run simulations inside of there. And that's already assuming that people own the hardware, so they're not having to worry about a server compute expense, right? You already have the Nvidia GPU. You're just getting a consulting fee from them to help you get set up and running, right? If I had to pick between the two, like I think the company that becomes very, very horizontally and very, very highly distributed would probably be Nvidia. It's just right now that developer hype has more cycles feeding into OpenAI.
My only additive thought to that, I agree mostly in that Nvidia is currently positioned as well as anybody probably could be to have kind of horizontal capture across this, the AI industry, if you will. I think with specific regard to GROC, where I see possible advantage there is in the inference, whether it be on device or otherwise, and just like how do we take these models that are really robust, but apply them to kind of lower kind of barrier entry tasks, and how do we make a highly qualified Siri or something like that? I'm saying, how do we kind of improve our personal devices in a way that is basically speed and cost focused, not performance cost? And I do think that's where maybe there is space for alternative options, AMD, GROC, or others, to kind of supplant Nvidia. So not necessarily in the model training itself, nor in kind of the spinning up these really robust AI applications, but these lighter weight kind of inference first, applications, if you will, in which speed and cost are the primary drivers. I do think there's some room to run in that space. So,
are you referring mostly to like edge computing, mobile computing use cases, or something else?
Feels to me like that's the most obvious of examples, yes. But I also, in addition to that, I think it's increasingly likely that we are all going to be interacting with a combination of models or a combination of agents, if we want to call them that, on a daily basis for daily tasks. And we're not really going to know which model we're interacting with immediately. Like to walk down an example, using the edge compute example that you did, it's like, let's say that we wanted to know the weather on our Apple Watch. That obviously could be done via Siri on device, right, on-prem. But then assuming that we wanted to follow up with that request and say, awesome, what's the weather in London, and can you please help me book a trip to London for next week or something like that, right? That sequence of events probably begins on device and then parlays itself into cloud computing based larger models that can actually help take those actions to book your travel itinerary, right? And so I do think we're going to see this kind of bridging of all of these kind of things in the future. How quickly we get there, I have kind of no intuition for, but it does feel to me like in the same way right now that these assistants on device do some tasks on device while passing other larger, heavier compute tasks to the cloud. I think we're going to similarly see kind of that baton passing with these agent systems as well.
Yeah, I think inevitably, like the perspective I'm taking is very consumer biased. It's hard for me to kind of visualize like what is the product being purchased and like what are the kind of like agreements that these companies who build these products have that then lend themselves to having multiple models over different chipsets, that sort of thing, right? Like I think like Apple, of course, like just picking them for the case of example, like obviously like on mobile hardware they're making their own chips. Totally envision them like having their own custom chipset designed for fast inference locally. That makes sense, right? I think where it becomes weirder, I guess, is in the decision making of like, okay, now we have cloud, we have Nvidia, there's this new GROC chip. I would assume most companies would be very, very inclined to just go with Nvidia by default, just given the robustness and the history. I don't know how much space there is to disrupt given how prominent Nvidia already is. If you're looking at like the cloud case, right? Aside from like supply demand being like a limiting factor.
I think it's cost. The only thing I can add in an additive statement to that is cost. I think you're exactly right, but I do just think there are going to be some AI tasks that can be accomplished with a lighter weight model in which the user is demanding instantaneous results and they're just simply not willing to pay enough to get the absolute best results. And that to me feels like if there is an area in which real competition with NVIDIA could arise, it's there. I'm not necessarily speculating that will be the case. That's just the only kind of use case I can envision in which you would be both cloud-based and cost/latency first, even in favor of an inferior other tech stack, basically.
Yeah, there's a big enough market and enough use cases that since the market's growing so fast, if GROC can capture any subsegment of use cases and outperform there, it's going to be a successful business. There's just so much demand. I'm curious. I was in a meeting just to add a question to the conversation. I was in a meeting and in which I was asked where in the AI space you would invest if you had a discretionary X dollars, let's say $1 million to invest in the AI space. You could pick any part of that spectrum. What would be the most interesting space to invest in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go first. I do a fair bit of sitting on this side of the table, and during my time at Duke Capital Partners, we do see a fair number of AI companies. It's a really challenging question. I think about it fairly often, and I think the only thing that I can deliver with any sort of conviction right now is that as we continue to progress, independent of how quickly the models improve and how capable the models get, delivering end user value is always going to kind of be the name of the game. And then in these various workflows, whether it be in science or law or business or anything else, setting yourself up to really understand the nuances of those businesses and to be able to deliver value such that you are not disruptive of the current user workflows, I think is going to become very important. So I think that there's a legitimate argument about how you get there, whether you build infrastructure or dev tools to enable AI applications to get there, or whether you focus all of your efforts, in this case, capital, on the verticalized applications that are trying to solve for these very granularized, workflow tasks. I think that you can make legitimate arguments on all fronts. But I think the thing that I have the most conviction in is that AI will become ultimately useful in a diversity of industries and for a diversity of professionals. The manner in which that tech stack will be developed out, meaning how much of the tech stack is owned by the model itself versus how much kind of additional support infrastructure material needs to be built around that model to ultimately deliver that end user functionality, I think is an unknown question. But I do think that delivering that end user value will be something that will be less commodity and more owned by the individual fulfillers of that need, right? So in kind of a more traditional B2B SaaS stack, I think that much like AWS owns a lot of the cloud computing for all of the B2B software applications, but a lot of B2B software applications exist on top of AWS. I think that's probably the future that we're heading for. So I think fundamentally the answer to this question really comes down to whether or not you want to kind of be betting on the winner take all place, which probably feels like foundation models, maybe some select developer tools, or if you want to be betting on, winners in a particular market segment, whether that be science, law, business, or otherwise. So
this might be a weird answer and maybe not the intent of the question. But I feel like if I just had like cash to throw at something, like let's say I just want to like kick a ball around with just some wild idea, I feel like I'd pick like IoT in some specific area, like something to the effect of like, let's assume these models are fantastic. What my job is in building some company or building some product is I'm going to assume my customers live in some environment, some physical real world environment. Let me do my part in giving the LM the best information possible about the real world that it's living in. So that way, like robotics, IoT devices, edge computing devices can then make the best decisions, but take the best actions possible. That's a couple leaps ahead from where we are. I think like I don't know if y'all saw the new Atlas robot that they made, the all electric one. I think a lot of these models are going to come down to like, in some cases, you are just trusting like a multimodal LM to read the video, like a robotic camera, and then take actions with hands. But I feel like there's enough complexity in like the space of real world physics that like more data, like RAG over real world sensor data has something there, like, aside from like, I think one, like if you had money to put into anything, like putting money into like factory chip development, of course, but something that's a little bit more punty that I feel like is yet to be properly explored would be that way.
That's a fun answer. I hadn't seen I just watched the Atlas video after you mentioned it. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so my take is much more boring and less futuristic and exciting. My take is you had X dollars, let's say $1 million to put to work. The data center space is almost unlimited demand at this point, and we can't build them fast enough. If you could find a piece of the data center space that was essential, and you could own a part of that supply chain, you're going to get paid in an almost unlimited demand space to provide it, and power. These chips rely on servers, they rely on server racks, they rely on data centers, and those data centers rely on power. And if you could somehow place a power plant right next to large data center developments and be the sole supplier of power, you've got a dedicated customer basically forever. So that's where I would play. It feels like that's the bottom of the stack is the most reliable right now. Data centers are going to be in need. Power is going to be in need. Server space is going to be in need. How we deploy it, to what problems, to be determined as we progress. How much will the foundational models do versus app developers, ecosystems? And I'll just say, like, I think both emotionally and practically, I hope for the ecosystem rather than the maximalist approach of OpenAI or Nvidia or any one behemoth. And I think that's proven to be true in the past, that ecosystems of smaller teams contributing toward their own slice of value to a greater whole has provided more end user value than one company trying to do and be everything to every user. I think that probably wins. And I think OpenAI fundamentally is dependent on Microsoft and Microsoft's platforms to provide their own applications. So I continue to think that OpenAI has a significant vulnerability there in being essentially a part of Microsoft's strategy. As we said before, Satya said, they're above OpenAI, they're below them. They have all their data and their models. Microsoft's basically got the keys to OpenAI. And I see that as a significant vulnerability. And I wonder if you guys see that as a long-term vulnerability too.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned the whole like ecosystem versus horizontal landing, I think like this place that like this might be looking too like techno optimist like perspective oriented, but like I feel like the place that I struggle a little bit with like what is the end state is that like it feels like the perfect end state for these systems that they're able to like make all of the next features themselves. Like the idea of like where the moat lives is like that you deliver end user value, but as we're going through this, like the moat to delivering end user value is decreasing as these systems get better on their own, right? And so the question is just like, how far, like, for example, is there a model that's good enough that you could tell the model, like, please start a business for this, like, healthcare customer I have, they need HIPAA protection. I'm just making a new EMR that can render on my Apple Watch. I don't know. Probably a couple models away, a good number of models away, but in the range of possibility, like hypothetically, right? It's not difficult to imagine. What ends up being like the curated bit is like the level of like human, almost like tune up, like little minor, like business, like the real hard stuff becomes like human interaction, human agreement, signatures, contracts, all that sort of stuff, right? You can't have an agent on both ends, at least in the modern day. I think with regards to the Microsoft vulnerability, I think it is one. I think what I am increasingly watching is what Gemini and Google are doing, because obviously they just own their whole thing end to end. And for anyone who's not aware, in the OpenAI like developer community, there was a very, very prominent like developer advocate. His name was Logan. He moved to Gemini, and like obviously a lot of my feed is based on stuff he's doing, but Gemini is also taking like a very, very developer forward like perspective. Obviously they are already like, they're a company that's already very, very horizontal by design. They have Gmail, they have Drive, they have all sorts of stuff. And so at some level, I think the Microsoft vulnerability is one, but especially because Google's getting a little bit more serious. In some ways, I feel that like, especially when you assume like developers are your first like playground for Gemini, what's really happening is like use cases are being discovered and proven out. It's just on Google to execute them and actually make them materialize.
I don't truly have very many thoughts around the vulnerability of these large companies being owned or operated by Microsoft. I think that what you're seeing is a almost demand for that, just because of how expensive these models are to train. So we've kind of reached a threshold in which no one can reasonably afford, especially given the current macroeconomic environment, to raise enough money to train their own models without some sort of alternative cash cow funding that approach. I mean, this is kind of the inspiration for the entire transition from OpenAI from a nonprofit to a for-profit, is they just simply couldn't raise enough money to train the models in the nonprofit sphere, thus the conversion. And then I think that just as an extension of that, then you get thus the dependency on Microsoft. So in a way, I don't necessarily see this as a vulnerability, more so just a consequence of how much capital is required to do the things that these companies are setting out to do. And they're simply just not being another lever for these companies to pull in order to get there. So I don't have speculation as to whether or not this is going to be proven to be fruitful as far as a partnership or an acquisition. I think that in some ways this speaks to, again, number one, the macroeconomic environment such that they can't raise money on their own to do these things. And number two, I think that in many ways, Microsoft is just using the levers available to them to acquire these companies in a way that is not an actual acquisition in order to avoid kind of, antitrust violations and otherwise. And so, I think that we are kind of seeing these things play out in real time as a function of this is the way it has to be done, given the kind of conditions we've set up.
I assume, I doubt, like, I don't know if this has been publicized, but I assume like OpenAI still like operates at pretty major loss quarter to quarter. Yeah, like no way, like ChatGPT or like developer costs are putting them in the positive, right? I think I
don't know what the data is, but I fundamentally believe that's true. Their marginal costs and their marginal profits are nowhere near each other.
Yeah, I think like especially when we see stuff like Sora and like what I assume are like these like massive research projects, like just like the nonprofit perspective just like entirely doesn't make sense. Like I don't see how you can pull off a Sora while being a nonprofit that also has like 70 other projects going on. Some of the papers that like with ScholarAI, like my go-to test paper for like just making sure everything's working is an OpenAI paper that they've even done stuff with like robotic dexterity, like manipulation of hand and objects and that sort of stuff. So if you ever see that on the website, that's because that's the one paper I keep testing against. But like they're just like they do so much. I think one thing that's interesting to me from like the way that OpenAI has been playing is that like, yes, their models and their ability to like train is very much backed by the Microsoft like friendship. But what they're kind of doing more and more, or at least it seems what they're doing more and more, is like using their expertise and the talent they have to implement models for other people in other cases. Like, for example, like Figure, like bringing their, what I assume is a vision model, to a robotics company to then do the rest of the lift. I wonder how that correlates, I guess in like the business sense of like, hey, we probably fine-tuned some model, or we did a lot of work on your half. Like, what's that agreement like? What's this figure company paying? What is OpenAI paying? Who owns what in that relationship?
Great. Okay. I think we're at time for today. So thank you all for joining us. Be sure to leave the comments in the section below, and we will see everybody next week for the next episode of the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Thanks again.